Welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us today. We have Tammi here from the Backyard Beekeepers Association going to educate us about beekeeping. Turn this over to you, Tammi.
Hi everyone, very nice to meet you. I'm Tammi Worsham. I work with an association called the Backyard Beekeepers. We're more of a club than anything super formal. We don't try to make money off of anything. We do a little bit of fundraising for the club, but mostly we get together to try to educate the public about the importance of bees and pollinators, and we help each other raise awareness, and we help each other support our hives and our bees. Next. So these are my hives. I have 7 more in different locations throughout Fairfield County. The 2 on the left are the hives in my own backyard, and then the right is a swarm that I recently caught from a neighbor's driveway. Next. Beekeepers use a lot of tools. You may have seen videos, and some of these might be familiar to you. In order to protect our skin from stings, beekeepers often wear an entire suit. The suit doesn't actually prevent us from being stung. We can still be stung through the suit. It just creates a thick layer so that it's less likely that the tiny stinger will penetrate the cloth to get to our skin. If you'll notice when you're wearing something like that, the material will still be very close to you on, for instance, your shoulders. And many beekeepers don't wear gloves. So oftentimes we're stung in the hands and sometimes in the places where there's a seam. The beekeeper's helmet zippers around the entire upper portion so that, and there's a little piece of Velcro that covers the place where the 2 zippers meet, just so the bees can't somehow crawl in. Bees are actually not very aggressive. Wasps and hornets are much more aggressive. Bees don't like it when, I always say, just like people, they don't like it when you mess with their babies. They don't like it when you steal their food, and they don't like it when you move around their furniture. And those are 3 things that we do whenever we enter the hive. You'll see in the picture, there's a smoker. This is a common tool that we use. It's stuffed with pine needles, dead leaves, anything that will create like a good thick smoke. We squeeze the bellows, and you can turn the top to direct the smoke, and you direct the smoke into the hive and towards the bees, and it calms them. Scientists don't really know why this works because we can't get into the head of a bee and figure it out, and they can't communicate with us. But scientists think that this works because the bees suddenly think that there's a forest fire. They go back into the hive and they start eating furiously. Just in case they need to pick up and find a new home, their stomachs will be full and they'll have enough food for a couple days to maintain the hive, keep the queen healthy, and feed the babies. To the other picture is a frame holder. It's something that you can use to lift parts of the hive out to examine them. And underneath that, with the red tip, is called a hive tool. It's something that you use to break. The bees glue parts of the hive together with a substance called propolis. It's something that you use to break the propolis so that you can pull things and move things around within the hive. Next. This is an illustration that shows you what a hive looks like and the parts of the hive. In the corner, you'll see a beekeeper picking up something. That's called a frame. A frame is usually covered in bees, and it is made of a wooden frame or a plastic frame, and the bees build the inside of the frame themselves. They build the foundation. It's made of wax, which is the same wax that you would use to make a candle, and the bees create small hexagonal chambers into which they put nectar, pollen, honey, or eggs. So each frame has many, many, many small chambers. They actually build the chambers as a circle, but because the chambers are pushed close together, they become hexagons. Each of the frames can pull out, and you can examine both sides of it. On the bottom is a frame that is just basic. There are no bees on it and nothing's inside of it. And you can look in the illustration and you see that in most hives, there are 10 frames per box, and each box the stacks on top of one another. And usually they have different purposes. The queen starts in the bottom to lay eggs, and usually the bees put food at the outside of the eggs, so on the edges of each hive box and in the upper portions of the hive. When you have a new package, there won't be a lot of wax inside of the hive, so the queen lays eggs only in the chambers that are complete. Next. Honeybees are social. Just like ants, they have different castes, and each caste has a different job within the hive. These are pictures of each of the types of bee. The queen bee is a female. There's only one single female and one single queen bee in the hive. The drones are males and the workers are all females. They look different. And when you look into the hive, you can immediately spot the queen, usually because she's significantly larger if she's a little bit older. She's fed very high protein food, and so she plumps up quickly. After maybe a year, oftentimes she won't even be able to fly because she's so fat. Next. There's only one queen in the hive. You can see in the picture that she's long and narrow. She lays between 1,000 and 1,200 eggs a day if she's been properly fertilized. She can live up to 3 years. You're lucky if she lives to be 4 years. However, once she reaches her 4th year, she often becomes less effective at laying eggs, and the workers can sense that, and they will create another queen to usurp her. Beekeepers often put a paint marking on her back so that she's easier to find in the hive, because if you're manipulating the hive and moving frames around, she's very, very important. And the last thing you would want to do is accidentally squish her. Next. There are male bees within the hive as well. They're called drones. You can see that their structure is a little bit different. Their eyes are larger and they sort of wrap around their entire head. Male bees are slightly larger than worker bees, but smaller than the queen, usually. Male bees don't have a lot of purpose. They usually live one season. Their only purpose is to mate with the queen. After they mate, their proboscis explodes, and it usually brings part of their body with it, and they die if they're able to mate with the queen. If they're unable to mate with the queen, they go out and fly for a little while, then they come back to the hive, and if the hive is healthy and it's summertime and there's enough food, sometimes the worker bees will allow the drone to still live inside of the hive and live out a natural life. If there's not that much food in the hive, the worker bees will swarm on top of the drone bee and pull him and yank him and throw him out of the hive, where he will starve to death or freeze to death. Drone bees don't know how to gather their own food. They don't know how to take care of the young. They literally do nothing inside of the hive except eat enough to be able to fly, to mate with the queen, and that's it. I mean, it kind of makes sense if, you know, you had some roommate in your house that did literally no work, you probably want to toss them out too. Next. The worker bees are the most numerous within the hive, and they literally do everything. They raise the queen, they clean the queen, they feed the queen, they move pollen and honey and nectar around in the hive to its most effective location. They create the honeycomb, they raise the young, they find the food, they store the food, they remove dirt from the hive, they clean, they remove dead bees from the hive. The worker bees do literally everything. They create wax by secreting small amounts from 8 glands on the underside of their body, and it's actually really adorable, but they can't really reach that area themselves. So they'll stand up on their tiny hind legs, and one of their sisters will come over and remove the bit of wax from the gland, put it in her mouth and chew it to soften it and warm it. And then she'll use that to make those hexagonal chambers that you see in the photo behind the worker bee, which is the main structure in the hive. Next. Thank you. There's a long history of beekeeping in the United States and in the world. The oldest, I wanted to show a video there, but unfortunately my computer is not being cooperative, so it wouldn't let me load the video. Sarah kindly, I emailed the presentation to her, and she kindly is working it on her computer instead of it working on mine, which it was not doing. The earliest fossilized evidence of bees is from a bee called a halictid, and it was a ground-dwelling bee. And we have early fossilized evidence from, I believe it was 2 billion years ago. Honeybees and flowers co-evolved in order to help each other. So flowers evolved colors and pollen for reproduction so that pollinators could help them reproduce. Pollinators, at the same time as flowers were developing, evolved specialized mouth parts and specialized body parts that would collect pollen, spread it, and they could feed on it. They co-evolved. And honey is an incredibly stable product. If you went into the tomb of King Tut, you would still be able to eat the honey. Honey is antimicrobial, it is antibacterial, and antifungal. If you got a cut on your hand and you had honey handy, you could use a little bit of honey in place of antibacterial ointment, and it would work to keep your wound clean. Next. These are some of the beekeepers in my club. The woman without the helmet, she's actually allergic to bees, but still works bees. She just carries an EpiPen with her because she loves it so much. And the other woman is carrying what is called a swarm. If you've ever seen that, it is a clump of bees that gathers in probably the crux of tree branches, or sometimes on a wall or a fence, or sometimes underneath an eave or on a staircase. Swarming is the natural reproductive process of a hive. If a hive grows too large for the space that it's in, some of the bees have to find a new home. They need space. So the worker bees will take a 2-day-old egg and they will start feeding it royal jelly. Royal jelly is the specialized high protein mix of nectar and pollen that they feed a queen. Feeding the queen this special food keeps her very healthy. Feeding an egg this special food makes a new queen. So once the bees feed the new queen, when she gets to be very close to when she hatches out of her chamber, the old queen will take half of the bees in the hive and she will leave the hive and look for a new home. So you can see this big clump of bees right here on this tree branch has a queen in there, and they are searching for a new place to live. They'll go to the crux of the tree and hang out there for a day or two until the bees that are scouts find a home that they find adequate for their space and for their needs. So if you ever see that, don't get any spray. They're not going to hurt you. They're literally just looking around for a new home. The best thing you can do if you see a swarm is call your local police department, and they should have a list of beekeepers. Or you can just Google search online for a local beekeeper. If you call any local beekeeper, I guarantee you that they will be very happy to come to your home and take those bees and put them in a hive. Next. So do we know what pollen is? In this picture, you can see that the back leg of the bee has a little orange, it looks like almost a pocketbook. This is a group of hairs, that 3 or 4, that grow a little bit longer on the bee, and they grab pollen and they stuff it underneath the hair. And it really is it's called a pollen pocket for that reason. It's how the bees transport the pollen home to the hive for consumption. Next. This is a photograph of a flower, and it summarizes the reproductive process of flowers. Flowers have male parts and female parts, and the male parts of the flower have to somehow get to the female part. This is where bees come in. Because bees eat pollen, they crawl into the flower and they wiggle around, and they get pollen all over their body, all over their heads, all over their antenna, all over their eyes, actually. And as they're moving around, they spread the pollen to the female parts, and they also spread the pollen to other flowers, pollinating other flowers and giving flowers genetic diversity. Next. Without pollination, we wouldn't have any of these foods. Each of these foods on this list is pollinated by bees. There are other methods for pollination, such as wind pollination or even hand pollination. But when you really think about it, if you have a field of almonds and you had to go into each almond flower and take a Q-tip and rub the Q-tip on the flower, and then go to another flower and rub the Q-tip on that flower, it would take 100 years to pollinate a field, and one almond would cost $300. So when you really think about it, we desperately need pollinators like bees, like flies, like butterflies, in order to make sure that our food supply remains stable. Also, bees have a hand in not only our food supply of fruits and vegetables, but pollinators have a hand in our food supply for cattle, because cattle eat alfalfa, which is pollinated by bees. Even our clothing is dependent upon pollinators, because cotton is pollinated by bees and by butterflies. Next. On the left is a picture of a tea flower. So when you really think about the importance of insects in the world around us, they are vital to everything. Everything from the clothing that we wear, to the meat that we eat, to everything on our plates, to the drinks that we have for pleasure and for caffeine. Next. This is a picture where you can have a comparison between a vegetable and some fruit that has been well pollinated, and vegetables and fruits that have been poorly pollinated. The cucumber on the left, the one that's fat and plump and juicy and delicious, has been pollinated properly, and the one that's withered and looks unhealthy has either been pollinated inadequately or has just not been pollinated. When you look very closely at that strawberry, you can see that the outside of it is irregular, and the outside of the strawberry is where the seeds are. So if the seeds are smaller and less plump, it means that it has been pollinated improperly, and that strawberry has much less of a chance of procreating, of creating more strawberry plants. And also, it tastes less sweet and less good. The squash flower on the top has just been entirely not pollinated and will not produce a fruit at all. Next. These are some other common plants in Connecticut that support bees and support pollinators. The top is called spiderwort. I have it in my yard. It grows like a weed. Bees love it. Butterflies love it. If you have it in your yard, don't kill it. The pink flowers are on autumn joy sedum. They grow very late in the season. They're still flowering in September, sometimes even in October. And that's the time of the year when the bees are desperately trying to store enough food that they can survive through the winter. That's the time when all of the moths and the solitary bees in your yard and butterflies are trying desperately to get enough fat and enough protein and enough food in their bodies so that they can make it through the cold winter months, or so that they can lay their eggs that will have enough of the food supply so that the eggs can live and hatch come spring. Next. Here are some other types of bees that live in Connecticut. In the world, there are 20,000 different species of bees, and in Connecticut, we have between 300 and 400 that are native. Honeybees are not the only types of bees in the world, and honeybees are actually not native to the United States. They originated in Europe. Honeybees live in a colony and produce this delicious food that we like to eat, which is why we farm honeybees. Honeybees in Connecticut are considered an agricultural product. You have to license them with the state. It's kind of, when you have hives, it's kind of like you own cattle or goats or sheep. They are considered an agricultural product and they're regulated by the state. The state inspector has a right to come to your hives at any time and go through your hives and inspect them to make sure that they're doing well and that you're not spreading viruses or diseases to other hives in your area. And also, as a benefit to the beekeeper, if you register your hives, if you're having trouble with one of your hives, you're seeing something that's odd, your bees are behaving strangely, you have the resource of our state beekeeper to call, and he'll come out usually the very next day after you call, and you can ask him any questions and he'll inform you whatever he knows about what's wrong with your bees. Oftentimes in Connecticut, when a field or your neighbors spray pesticides all over their yard, you might have the death of a colony over the summer, which is quite frankly tragic. And if an exterminator or a landscaper is spraying pesticides in a property that is next to a registered beekeeper, they're required by law to inform you that they're going to spray, although oftentimes they don't, unfortunately. And if you know in advance, you can protect your hive by closing off the bees for that one day, covering it with wet towels or wet sheets so that they stay inside of the hive so that they don't eat pesticides and cause colony death. If a honeybee is exposed to pesticides one single time in its life, it will produce 1/3 less honey over its lifetime. And oftentimes if drones are exposed, they will be unable to reproduce at all. If a queen is exposed and dies, the hive has a chance of collapsing entirely. So neonicotinoids and pesticides don't only hurt honeybees, but they hurt native bees as well. These are some examples of native bees that live in Connecticut. The bee on the green bee, the one that looks very bright, almost like jewelry, is called a sweat bee. It actually is kind of teeny tiny. If you looked at your pinky fingernail, it would probably be about the size of your pinky. They love flowers that are yellow, and each of these native bees has specialized mouth parts that pollinate particular kinds of native flowers most effectively. And some of them can only feed on one type of flower or one type of plant. So for instance, alfalfa bees only feed on alfalfa. So if alfalfa was to stop being produced in a particular area, that species of bee would die out. This is why there is a movement to start a pollinator pathway that goes from Florida all the way up the East Coast to Maine, so that many different species that feed on one particular type of pollinator plant specifically can travel up and down the coastline and hopefully improve their numbers, because lots of bee species are dying out. Again, we say that there are 300 to 400 native species in Connecticut because over the past 100 years, we've lost a number of species and we're having trouble spotting a number of species of bees. So people that keep track of this are really crossing their fingers and hoping that people can take pictures and observe their yards carefully to see if they can spot some of these rare bees that haven't been seen in a number of years, so that we can guarantee that they continue living, that they continue keeping our environment healthy. The bee on the other bee is a bumblebee. You've probably seen them in your yards. They sort of buzz around and fly in a way that's kind of clumsy, and they'll often bang into your windows. Next. Other ways that you can support native bees, if you don't want to go through the effort and possibly getting stung by honeybees, is you can support mason bees. Mason bees and leafcutter bees live in tubes that are a particular diameter. You can buy bee houses online. They're about 20 bucks. They're very inexpensive. And these bees don't have stingers, so they can't sting you. They don't produce honey, but they do pollinate your flowers. If you have blueberries or strawberries or any kind of berries, orchard mason bees and leafcutter bees are great at pollinating vegetable gardens. They are very easy to raise. You can buy eggs over the winter and they'll mail you a package, and you can just insert the little cocoons into each of the tubes and you can watch them at play and at work. They have sort of interesting habits. The males hatch 2 days before the females. If you see that the males have hatched, it's like clockwork. You know that 2 days later, the female will be hatching. As soon as the female hatches and eats her way out of the tube, she is immediately mated with. And then, again, the male bees go off and live their life and probably shortly afterwards die. And the females go around to many different plants and they'll go back into the same tube that they were born in, go to the very, very back and start making a little pile of pollen. Once the pile becomes big enough, they'll lay one single egg in it, go back outside and hang out by your hose if it's leaking or any source of water. They'll gather up clay and mud from underneath and they'll go back into that tube and they'll wall it off. And then they'll repeat the process over and over again until the tube is full. Once the tube is full, they'll move to the next tube and do that over and over again until they lay as many eggs as possible until it gets too cold. And then the female will die and the whole process will start again next year. The mason bees and orchard bees live for about 2 months and they can fly at lower temperatures than honeybees. So they get kind of like a jump start on the food season. They get out there, they get flying, they start collecting food a couple of days before honeybees because they can fly at 52 degrees and honeybees can only fly at 55 degrees. Next. So this is one of the bees that's a little bit more rare in Connecticut. You can see it's super, super fuzzy. They have specialized muscles next to where their wings connect to their body that flaps at a very high frequency. And that allows them to spread pollen more effectively than honeybees. And this type of bee, you might see them sleeping inside of flowers in your yard when it gets to be a little bit rainy. Right before the rain, they crawl into a flower for shelter and they curl up and they literally fall asleep. So if you see one in this position, you can reach your finger in and pet it and it will not sting you and it will not be bothered and it will continue sleeping. So try it at some point. Pet a bee. Next. Bees often get a bad rap because these other types of pollinators sting people. Bees can only sting one single time, and then their stinger is left in your skin, and it will continue to pump, 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 and it pumps venom into your body. So if you're ever stung, just take your fingernail and scratch that stinger out as soon as possible, and you'll have less of a reaction. Wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets can sting multiple times. Bees and other insects communicate via pheromones. So if a wasp or a bee stings you, the area of the sting will have a little bit of an odor that other bees and wasps can detect. So if you're stung, wash the area very thoroughly to get off that pheromone so that if you go outside, you won't attract other wasps and hornets and yellow jackets or other bees to the area. So even though they sting you, wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets are still very important pollinators. They spread pollen in the same way that bees do. If you have a wasp's nest or a hornet's nest and it's not close to your house and it's not close to your door, and you can just leave it alone, just leave it alone. Their stings are painful, but they're still a very important part of the food chain. Birds eat wasps and skunks, voles, moles, lots of other small animals can pillage a wasp or hornet's nest for food. So if possible, and if they're not bothering you, do your best to just leave them alone and not spray them. Next. Oh, actually, so hold on one second, I can't see what that is. Oh, so in Connecticut, we have something called the magnolia beetle. Earlier, I was talking about how bees and insects and flowers co-evolved. These beautiful, gorgeous trees that Connecticut residents have in their yards. These lovely, lovely, huge flowers that are fragrant and cover the ground in beautiful petals. They co-evolved with a particular beetle called the magnolia beetle. Its mouth parts are very specifically the length of the top of the flower to the interior of the flower. It pollinates magnolias the most effectively. And this one particular beetle can only live on magnolia plants. So it's just another example of how if we lose one species, there's a chain reaction that just goes throughout the food chain where one species has a very large importance. One species dies and another species dies because that species is the food for the second species. And traveling further and further up the food chain. Those magnolia beetles are fed on by a particular type of bird that hatches early and needs to feed its young. So each section of the food chain is important. And even though some insects look gross, cause a reaction if you're stung by them, or sometimes seem like a nuisance, each one is very important. Next. This bee is called a halictid. It has, it is tiny. It's about 1 millimeter in length. And it is the earliest bee species that we have evidence of, and it is still alive today. Next. There are lots of ways to help bees. You can become a beekeeper or join the Pollinator Pathway, which means that you would take a pledge to plant native plants in your garden and to not use pesticides. You can encourage pollinators by keeping pollen-rich plants in your garden and by companion planting, which means planting not only, you can Google search it. I'm not going to go into it too much. You can buy local honey. And if you do need to spray pesticides in your lawn, you can follow the instructions very carefully. Only spray the leaves and the stems and don't spray the flowers. And if you need to, spray at night when the bees are sleeping. Next. There are a number of different types of diseases that affect bees. This is a list of all of the ones that are common. Bees are very much, not only honeybees, but all bees are very much in decline. And really, we need to do all that we can to make sure that this important part of our ecosystem remains healthy, specifically so that we can continue to eat. Next. Each picture is one of the threats to honeybees. You can see that there are a number that are viral and there are a number that are parasitic. And then there are a number that you wouldn't think of, but skunks love honeybees. Honeybees have developed a defense characteristic where they simply go for the eyes, mouth, and nose of a skunk to prevent it from eating their babies. It's brilliant how smart bees are. Unfortunately, they can't fight quite as well against bears because bears are so big and their fur is thick. So the honeybees have difficulty getting to the bear's skin. So it's very hard for bees to sting a bear. Bees don't actually want the honey from a hive. They mostly want to eat the larva. Next. We do have, there's still a question in the scientific community about what is causing colony collapse disorder. We haven't found one single cause. We can't really say that it's entirely pesticides. We can't really say that it's entirely monoculture crops. We can't really say that it's entirely stress from pollution. We're not really sure what it is exactly, but we are finding that insect populations, not only honeybees, are declining throughout the world. Next. These are some products that bees make: honey, pollen, propolis, and wax. Wax is used to make candles. Honey is delicious. Pollen, people with allergies often take pollen to help their bodies create a different histamine response to allergens. So a lot of people are interested in buying honey from New Zealand or from Australia. Those types of honey probably won't be as useful to your own immune system, because you would need to be consuming a product of pollen that is created in the same environment that you're breathing. So you want to have honey and pollen from bees that are eating the flowers that are in your area. So getting honey from far away doesn't actually have the same medicinal properties as buying honey from a local beekeeper. Next. At this point, if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I really appreciate the audience.